The crystalline light of the conclave chamber, filtered through the immense, pulsating heart crystal of the Cathar hegemony's central administration spire, did nothing to alleviate the pervasive, cold dread that settled like deep space vacuum in the chest cavity of Archvizier Xylos. The chamber was a testament to impossible scale, a cavern of polished obsidian and living metal conduits, where the elevated dais of the Grand Council floated above a sea of minor functionaries, and the hushed, heavy silence of 3,000 years of uninterrupted galactic dominance. Across the polished floor, the Grand Marshal Rylok, a monolith of scaled armor and coiled aggression, shifted his mass. The sound of his armored gate a subtle, deliberate challenge in the otherwise absolute stillness. The vizier drew a deliberate breath into his tertiary lung, the air a dense, cool mixture of synthetic oxygen and calming pheromones, and began the address that he knew would either save the hegemony from its own arrogance or lead to his swift, quiet execution. "The calculus of expansion," Xylos stated, his voice a low, resonant baritone that nevertheless carried the weight of impending annihilation through the chamber's complex sonic dampeners, "must always account for the unknown variable, not merely the quantifiable resistance. We have indexed countless nascent civilizations, judged them by the metrics of their energy consumption, their FTL topology, the density of their martial fleets. We have classified them all with chilling accuracy into categories of threat: A-insurrection, B-contained, C-pliant. The species designated Terran, the designation itself a stark, singular anomaly in our comprehensive census, does not fit any established category, and this conclave is the terrifying heart of the matter." His multifaceted eyes, usually reflecting the cold light with the detached logic of a pure strategist, now betrayed a flicker of profound psychological uncertainty, an anomaly that sent ripples of discomfort through the seated counselors, beings who prided themselves on their absolute emotional mastery. Rylok's voice, a grating, amplified hiss of synthetic contempt, sliced through the tension. "Archvizier, your terrifying heart is a small, insular collection of systems barely beyond the Perseus arm, utilizing a FTL drive that is inefficient by hegemonic standards and demonstrating no aggressive territorial expansion. Their collective energy signature registers below that of a medium-tier B-contained industrial satellite cluster. Your fear is a political instrument, nothing more. We have presented the ultimatum: cede the contested mineral-rich asteroid fields on the outer delineation, or face immediate punitive disarmament. Their refusal is an act of calculated self-destruction, and your incessant pleading for caution only emboldens their defiance. What precisely is the source of this sudden, inexplicable terror that has consumed your typically pristine logical pathways?" The Grand Marshal's posture, a deliberate display of effortless power, was designed to intimidate, but Xylos did not flinch, his internal processor already running the inevitable scenario with detached, brutal clarity. "The terror, Grand Marshal," Xylos countered, leaning slightly forward, projecting a controlled gravity that forced the counselors to fully engage, "stems from the very absence of the expected metrics. You speak of energy consumption and fleet composition. I speak of ethical velocity and conceptual topology. We classify aggressive species by the predictable arc of their ambition. The Terrans exhibit none of this. They encountered our forward reconnaissance probes, armed with sensor negation fields and high-yield plasma lances, not with defensive fire, not with an immediate declaration of war, but with a simple, instantaneous data packet. A warning, yes, but delivered with the detached courtesy of a groundskeeper closing a gate." Xylos paused, allowing the image of the massive, expansionist Cathar hegemony being addressed by a groundskeeper to settle in the ancient minds of the Council. He projected the data onto the central holofield, a crystalline, three-dimensional representation of a single Terran vessel, unremarkable in size, stationary on the fringe of the disputed zone. This vessel, designated the Unflinching Vigil, responded to our probe's unauthorized penetration of their self-declared sanctuary perimeter. It did not fire a weapon. It did not even power up its energy shields. Instead, the Terran craft broadcast a single, brief, perfectly encrypted sequence. The sequence contained no linguistic information, no threats, only the complex mathematical schema for the immediate and catastrophic destabilization of a hegemonic-grade hyperdrive core should it exceed a specific, calculated spatial velocity within that zone. The council chamber, already tense, now hummed with a new, sharper uncertainty. Destabilization, not destru. CD on, a surgical strike aimed at rendering the means of aggression useless, not the aggressor itself. We tested the schema, Xylos admitted, the shame of the inevitable discovery a sour tang on his vocalizer. On a surplus-class Delta cruiser undergoing decommissioning. The result was not an explosion, which would be predictable, but a total instantaneous spatial nullification. The ship did not fragment. It ceased to exist in 4 dimensions, leaving behind only the gravitational shadow of where it should have been, calculated down to the picosecond of its erasure. They demonstrated a mastery over the fundamental forces that we, with all our accumulated knowledge and technological primacy, have only theorized upon. They do not possess a larger fleet because they do not need one. Their defense is not a shield of kinetic energy or particle beams, but a conceptual lock on the physics of engagement. Grand Marshal Rylock, struggling to contain his military-minded rage, retorted, his claws tapping a percussive rhythm on his armored thigh. A parlor trick, a single demonstration of a localized, high-yield exotic weapon that requires immense power input. They expended this power on a scrap vessel to frighten us. We have the mass, Archvizier. We have the sheer, overwhelming scale. Our combined first and second phalanxes could saturate that entire sector with enough firepower to boil the atmosphere off their core world. Fear of a sophisticated, localized weapon is irrational when confronted with the reality of infinite, relentless attrition. We are the hegemony. We reduce systems to dust and rebuild them to our specifications. We are the architects of the galactic order. And that, Xylos's voice dropped, becoming infinitely colder, infinitely more menacing, is precisely the flaw in your analysis, Marshal. You view power as destruction. The Terrans view power as control. Their capacity for violence is not expressed in the size of their war machines, but in the terrifying serenity of their political conduct. They are the only species we have encountered in the known void who, when offered a unilateral, unconditional peace treaty, a gesture of hegemonic magnanimity designed to lure them into economic subservience, responded with an 8-line counterproposal that surgically dismantled the entire legal and philosophical foundation of our colonial claim, and then politely inquired if we required humanitarian aid for our struggling outer sector colonies, which they identified through our own public data streams. They showed us they knew more about the internal distress of the hegemony than the conclave itself, and offered charity as a weapon. A palpable shudder went through the room. The Cathar hegemony was built on the pretense of flawless internal stability and endless resource abundance. The Terrans had, in a single, cold diplomatic exchange, pointed a precise, ethical laser at the Empire's deepest vulnerability, its internal, resource-based instability, and masked it behind a veil of unwarranted kindness. If we attack, Xylos concluded, his voice trembling slightly with the weight of his conviction, they will not retaliate with plasma or kinetics. They will, I believe, respond with a level of calm, ethical, logical efficiency that will unravel the very fabric of our civilization. They will not defeat our fleets. They will render our empire obsolete. They will reduce your hegemony to philosophical ashes. Do not attack the humans. The final sentence hung in the air, a prophecy carved in crystalline dread, the atmosphere now thick with the political poison of unprecedented internal discord and the profound, humbling fear of a truly other power. The conclave descended into a chaotic, silent contemplation of this impossible choice. The philosophical reflection that followed, conducted in the private, cloistered meditation chamber deep within the spire's foundations, was a Cathar necessity, a ritual designed to purge individual irrationality from collective strategic thought. Vizier Xylos stood before a pulsing, deep blue sphere that absorbed all ambient sound, leaving only the reverberation of his own internal monologue. The Cathar mind, a matrix of hyperlogical, networked processors, struggled with the Terran enigma. The hegemony's success was predicated on a fundamental truth, that all expanding civilizations followed the same predictable thermodynamic trajectory, a drive for energy, resources, and self-preservation through preemptive aggression. The Terrans defied this. They had access to resources, yet only expanded to a modest, defensible perimeter. They possessed obvious technological superiority, yet refused to monetize or militarize it in the expected fashion. Their conduct was not merely peaceful, it was apathetic towards the known rules of galactic engagement. Xylos closed his ocular shields, recalling the moment of his profound psychological break, the true source of his terror, the analysis of the data. From the sanctuary perimeter incident, his team, elite code breakers and physics engineers, spent cycles attempting to decode the underlying mechanism of the spatial nullification. They found no power signature that could account for the effect, no exotic matter annihilation, no massive gravitational spike. The Terrans hadn't fueled the event, they had merely commanded it. The mathematics embedded in the warning packet were not a blueprint for a weapon, but a fundamental theorem of control over the local dimensional parameters, proving that for the Terrans, spacetime itself was a malleable, locally programmable variable. They were not wielding technology. They were manipulating the laws of the universe with the casual indifference of a sculptor with clay. This realization, that the Terrans lived in a different, higher-order reality where the hegemony's physics were quaint approximations, had rendered Xylos's entire life's work in galactic strategy meaningless. The hegemony was not confronting a rival power. It was confronting the intellectual and physical equivalent of a fundamental law of nature. The conclave, however, was not composed of unified philosophical minds. They were political entities, ancient and steeped in the necessity of maintaining the illusion of absolute superiority. The Grand Marshal Rylock, having retreated to his tactical war room, was already initiating the secondary phase of his plan. A massive, covert mobilization of the reserve battle groups, disguised as deep space resource extraction convoys, positioning them for a rapid response saturation strike should the diplomatic talks, which Rylock had grudgingly permitted, fail to produce immediate capitulatory results. Rylock could not comprehend control without force. He viewed the Terran spatial nullification as a hyper-advanced landmine, easily circumnavigated with sufficient mass and strategic deployment. The very concept of philosophical ashes was alien to him. His empire was built on a foundation of iron and the blood of lesser species, not fragile political unity. This political chasm defined the crisis. Xylos knew that the moment Rylock's forces, however disguised, crossed the agreed-upon negotiation threshold, the Terran conquered would perceive it not as a military maneuver, but as an act of fundamental logical inconsistency and ethical failure. And the Terrans, he suspected, dealt with logical inconsistency and ethical failure not with righteous fury, but with cold, surgical elimination of the inconsistent variable. The hegemony was moving, inexorably, toward a calculated self-immolation. ACT-2, the logic of tranquility. The Terran vessel designated the Tranquility of Ages arrived not on a vector of aggression, nor on the predetermined, heavily monitored diplomatic lane, but simply appeared at the hegemony's orbital rendezvous station, the Crucible of Stars, a distance precisely calculated to be beyond the optimal lock range of the station's heavy particle cannons, yet close enough for immediate visual and diplomatic contact. It did not announce its arrival through standard radio burst. The station's command center merely registered a sudden, infinitesimal harmonic resonance ripple in the local spacetime fabric, followed by the passive electromagnetic signature of the Terran ship. The Tranquility of Ages was an aesthetic and technological paradox. A sleek, unadorned obsidian monolith, utterly devoid of visible weapon ports, engines, or shielding emitters, yet its sheer presence exerted a gravitational and energetic field that subtly but measurably altered the internal balance of the Crucible of Stars, causing minor, inexplicable fluctuations in the station's core fusion reactor. The psychological effect on the Cathar crew was immediate and profound. They were not witnessing a ship. They were witnessing a localized pocket of rearranged reality. Ambassador Kalen Vance, the Terran envoy, disembarked not in a battle-honed assault vessel, but in a small, self-propelled shuttle whose hull appeared to be woven from solidified starlight, its movement through the docking bay air almost unnervingly silent. He was a figure of quiet, unremarkable human presence. No visible armor, no retinue of armed guards, merely a single, small, passive drone that floated slightly behind him. His attire was a simple, deep blue uniform, devoid of rank insignia or ostentatious display. He met Archvizier Xylos and a small delegation of the Conclave's diplomatic corps in the designated Chamber of First Contact, a room deliberately crafted by the Cathar to project overwhelming architectural dominance. Vast, vaulted ceilings, reflective floors designed to amplify the Cathar delegates' imposing height and heavy, oppressive atmosphere. Vance stood in the center, a small island of calm in a sea of alien grandeur, and for a long moment before any formalities were exchanged, he simply surveyed the chamber, not with awe or intimidation, but with the measured, detached curiosity of an architectural historian examining an ancient, elaborate mechanism. His stillness was not submissive. It was the stillness of a predator that is already aware of the outcome. The lead delegate, Vizier Karak, a political moderate reluctantly present, initiated the proceedings, his voice a cautious blend of traditional hegemonic hauteur and newly mandated prudence. Terran Envoy Kalen Vance, you stand before the designated representatives of the Cathar hegemony, the supreme authority of the known void. Your people have violated established territorial protocols and refused a direct, non-negotiable ultimatum regarding the contested sectors. We require an immediate and unconditional declaration of intent to comply, along with full disclosure of the technological architecture responsible for the recent, highly provocative, and highly destabilizing incident near the sanctuary perimeter. Your continued ambiguity is interpreted as an act of existential aggression. Ambassador Vance waited a full, elongated moment after the vizier finished, allowing the Cathar's words to fully decay into the chamber's silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was a smooth, low register, devoid of the aggressive inflection the Cathar were accustomed to. It was simply a voice of pure, unvarnished logic. Vizier Karak, the Terran conquered acknowledges the complex political necessity that dictates the phrasing of your demand. However, the premise of your statement contains multiple, significant inaccuracies that must be addressed before the negotiation can proceed to any meaningful conclusion. This is not an act of defiance, but an act of necessary calibration. He held up a hand, not to silence, but to acknowledge. Firstly, the Terran conquered operates under the premise that territorial claims based purely on historical precedents or military projection are, in a mature galactic society, ethically inconsistent and strategically fragile. The disputed sectors contain no unique resources. We have already modeled their geological composition that justify the expenditure of political capital currently being deployed. Therefore, the hegemony's insistence on this specific territory indicates a motive that is not purely resource-based, but is instead related to internal political appeasement, specifically the mollification of the increasingly volatile expansionist faction led by Grand Marshal Rylock. The sudden, chilling precision of the assessment, a direct, public statement of Cathar internal politics delivered with casual certainty, caused a shockwave of silence. Vizier Karak's multifaceted eyes narrowed in profound distress. That information is classified, Envoy. Your intelligence gathering is a gross violation of sovereignty. Sovereignty, Vance countered, his expression utterly impassive, is a function of internal cohesion and external defensibility. The data used to formulate that conclusion is entirely public. A correlation of hegemony-controlled sector resource allocation, internal commodity price fluctuations, and the political promotion cycles of the Grand Marshal's key subordinates, all available in the Hegemonic Statistical Digest, published quarterly for the trading guilds. We merely applied a standardized socio-political predictive algorithm, a tool we share freely with all interested parties. We did not violate your sovereignty. We simply read your public narrative and deduced the underlying logistical truth. He paused, allowing this unexpected reveal of human analytical depth, the ability to read an entire empire's secret weaknesses in its financial reports, to sink in. Secondly, Vance continued, moving seamlessly past the hegemony's distress, regarding the highly provocative incident. The Terran conquered designated that spatial volume a sanctuary perimeter, not as a military buffer, but as a critical infrastructure zone. Within that volume, we are conducting necessary, complex, and potentially hazardous maintenance on a specific node of the standardized Galactic Infrastructure Network, SGIN, which we inherited from a previous, defunct civilization. The hegemony's probes, by their unpredictable and erratic trajectory, posed an unacceptable risk of collision and disruption to this delicate procedure. Our response, the temporary, localized displacement of matter in that region, was not a weapon demonstration, but an automatic, non-lethal, self-correcting safety protocol. We treated your probes as stray debris entering a construction site. The claim of standardized galactic infrastructure network was dismissed instantly by Karak, whose scientific education dictated that the hegemony was the progenitor of all complex FTL and communication architecture in the local arm. SGIN is a myth, Envoy, a convenient fabrication. It is not, Xylos interrupted, his voice cutting across the delegate S with the urgency of pure self-preservation. Vizier Karak, silence. Continue, Envoy Vance. Explain the nature of this. In tenets, Xylos had already run a partial background check on the humans' public statements and found a strange, recurring pattern of subtle, verifiable historical claims that the hegemony's own archaeological digs had dismissed as impossible. Ambassador Vance turned slightly toward Xylos, a faint, almost imperceptible acknowledgement in his posture, a sign that he recognized the vizier's strategic importance. The maintenance, Archvizier, involves the calibration of a subspatial communication conduit, a system far older than your hegemony, dating back to the architects of the void, a civilization that predates the emergence of sentient life in this region by hundreds of thousands of cycles. This network is not a military asset. It is a passive, transgalactic sensor array designed for long-range surveillance of phenomena. The hegemony, in its current developmental phase, does not even possess the theoretical framework to identify, let alone anticipate. This was the large-scale reveal, delivered not with fanfare, but with the dry, clinical tone of an academic paper. The Terrans were not the nascent power the hegemony believed them to be. They were the quiet custodians of a cosmic-scale infrastructure built by impossibly ancient hands, and their technological prowess was merely the means of servicing this inheritance. The hegemony's aggressive posturing in this context was revealed as the tantrum of a child interfering with the work of an adult. "Your people," Vizier Karok managed, his voice now a hollow croak, struggling to process the implications of a civilization existing 500,000 cycles before their own rise, "have somehow acquired the technology of these mythical architects and use it for maintenance." "We do not acquire it, Vizier," Vance clarified, his tone now taking on a subtle pedagogical depth. "We simply understood it. The Terran conquered values knowledge and stewardship over appropriation and conquest. We determined that the highest ethical use of this inherited network was to maintain its function, to keep the lights on, so to speak, because its original purpose was not related to local conflict, but to a vast, external existential threat that remains a persistent variable in this sector of the galaxy." He fixed his gaze on the council members, his human eyes holding a depth of historical and cosmic perspective that dwarfed their 3,000-year empire. "Your military, Grand Marshal Rylok's fleet in particular, is an engineering marvel designed to win a war of the past. The maintenance protocols we enacted were designed to ensure we are not distracted from preparing for the war of the future." The meeting dissolved into a tense, stunned silence. The Terrans had not capitulated, they had not threatened. They had simply recalibrated the entire context of the negotiation, proving their strategic superiority not through a show of force, but through a chilling demonstration of superior knowledge and ethical maturity. Xylos felt a perverse sense of relief, the validation of his fear. The Terrans were exactly as he predicted, calm, logical, terrifyingly ethical, and strategically leagues beyond the Cathar. Meanwhile, in the shadows, Grand Marshal Rylok, having monitored the entirety of the dialogue, perceived not a truth, but a complex, sophisticated lie designed to mask a fatal weakness. He could not process the concept of power being utilized for maintenance or stewardship. To him, the Terrans were hiding their true weapon behind an elaborate philosophical decoy. His reserve fleet, disguised as a dense asteroid mining formation, was now crossing the pre-designated military threshold, operating on a silent, independent protocol of his design. Rylok intended to force the Terran hand, to expose the limits of their spatial nullification trick by overwhelming it with sheer, relentless mass and energy. The hegemony would not be reduced to ashes by philosophical rhetoric. It would secure its dominance with the hammer of pure, unadulterated force. The inevitable collision arrived not as a dramatic conflagration, but as a technological non-event that redefined warfare for the Cathar hegemony forever. As Rylok's mining conv, a formidable, concentrated strike force of over 500 heavy cruisers and accompanying destroyer escorts, covertly activated their FTL stabilization fields for the jump into Terran space, the ships were instantaneously and simultaneously subjected to a non-violent intervention. There were no energy spikes, no warning lights, and no enemy signatures detected. The fleet simply woke up in a different reality. Every single vessel, from the largest dreadnought to the smallest scout craft, found itself orbiting a pale, insignificant blue giant star located in a completely different galaxy group, separated from the Cathar hegemony by a distance measured in multiple tens of thousands of light years. The ships were entirely intact, their systems fully functional. Yet their navigational databases and FTL jump sequence buffers had been surgically overwritten with a single, massive data packet that contained a complete, verifiable astronomical map of their new, distant location. The psychological effect was devastating. The fleet was not destroyed. It was simply relocated with zero casualties to a place of utter strategic irrelevance. Moments after the bewildered fleet registered their impossible predicament, they received a broadcast, non-encrypted, from the Terran Conquered. It was Ambassador Vance's voice, calm, professional, and utterly devoid of triumph. Grand Marshal Rylock, your fleet's unauthorized entry into the sanctuary perimeter necessitated a system-wide safety intervention. The maneuver was executed as a precautionary maintenance measure for the structural integrity of the local space-time continuum. Your vessels have been relocated to the designated Quarantine Zone Gamma, a sterile volume of space with negligible strategic value. The Terran Conquered regrets any inconvenience caused by this temporary, non-lethal displacement. We advise against any further unauthorized travel into infrastructure zones until proper safety protocols can be jointly established. This was the final, devastating act of the human reveal. The Terrans had demonstrated not a weapon of mass destruction, but a weapon of absolute strategic irrelevance. They had the capacity to excise the entire military arm of the hegemony from the galaxy without firing a single shot or causing a single loss of life. Rylock's arrogance was shattered. His iron-willed ambition had been reduced to a politely delivered logistics error. The philosophical ashes Xylos had warned of now lay scattered across the conclave chamber floor, manifesting as the cold, hard logistical fact of the hegemony's utter helplessness against a power that commanded reality itself. ACT-3, Unity and Larger Twist. The aftermath in the conclave chamber was a spectacle of profound, silent political collapse. Grand Marshal Rylock, recalled from the quarantine zone in a specialized long-range diplomatic scout, stood before the conclave, his scaled armor now appearing less like a symbol of strength and more like the brittle shell of a broken promise. His attempted war of annihilation had been thwarted by a precautionary maintenance measure. The military-industrial complex of the hegemony, the very engine of its galactic dominance, had been rendered obsolete in a single, surgical act of physics manipulation. The political pendulum swung violently back to Archvizier Xylos, whose terrifying predictions were now validated as prophetic truth. Vizier Karok, now representing the humbled majority, initiated the inevitable. Archvizier Xylos, you have been granted the authority to conduct all further interaction with the Terran Conquered. Our survival now hinges on understanding the true nature of their intentions. Grand Marshal Rylock's faction is immediately dissolved, its assets reassigned to humanitarian relief. The full resources of the hegemony are now committed to the creation of a binding, permanent, and mutual defense pact with the Terran Conquered. The Cathar had finally been humbled, their arrogance replaced by a cold, desperate pragmatism. They were survivors first and conquerors second. The subsequent alliance negotiation, conducted not in the oppressive chamber, but in a neutral, aesthetically balanced Terran-designed habitat orbiting a distant, mutually agreed-upon gas giant, was a study in cultural contrast. Ambassador Vance, seated across the table from a weary, intensely focused Xylos, presented the Terran Conquered's terms. Not territorial concessions, nor resource levies, nor technology transfer, but two primary, non-negotiable demands. The Terran Conquered requires two things from the Cathar hegemony, Vance explained, his hands resting flat on the table, not in dominance, but in utter calm. First, the immediate, verifiable cessation of all offensive military programs and the unilateral dismantling of all preemptive aggression protocols. We require the hegemony to reorganize its resource allocation from conquest to systematic stability and internal ethical consistency. You must stop being a threat to yourselves and your neighbors. Xylos nodded, understanding that this was the core of the Terran ethical mandate. And the second. Vance's gaze held a depth that transcended diplomacy, touching on the shared existential fear of all sentient life. The second requirement is full, unconditional access to the hegemony's entire, archived databank of deep space sensor readings, specifically focusing on phenomena external to the local galactic arm, dating back to the inception of your civilization. Xylos leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. This is about the architects of the void and the existential threat you mentioned. Your maintenance of the SGIN network is a long-term defense project. What Envoy Vance are you truly defending against? What is the cost of the knowledge you possess that forces you to exercise this level of terrifying ethical restraint? Ambassador Vance activated the hollow table. The image projected was not of a fleet or a weapon, but of an unimaginable void, a region of space so vast it dwarfed the local galactic arm. In the center of this field, surrounding a star that was not merely dead, but had been meticulously, entirely consumed, was the source of the Terran obsession. It was a structure of impossible scale, not a typical Dyson sphere or ring, but a matryoshka swarm, a layered, multi-shell megastructure of unparalleled complexity, kilometers deep in every direction, wrapping the dead star in a cage of dark matter collectors and impossible computing engines. It was dark, silent, and ancient, but its architecture was one of pure, unrestrained, terrifying power, the antithesis of the Terran's quiet, conservative design. This, Vance stated, his voice now imbued with the heavy, solemn weight of true revelation, is designated by the Terran conquered as the Silent God engine. It is not an artifact of the architects, it is what destroyed them. The architects were a civilization of boundless curiosity and unparalleled technological might. They encountered this structure, or the civilization that built it, at the height of their own power. They did not retreat. They attempted to understand it, to interact with it, to incorporate it into their own network. Their final, tragic sensor data, recovered by the Terrans through the SGIN, indicated a sudden, complete systems shutdown, an instantaneous, universal erasure of their consciousness and technological footprint. They vanished as if they had never been. Xylos felt a cold dread that surpassed the fear of the Terrans' physics manipulation. This was the cosmic-scale threat that made the hegemony's territorial squabbles appear as noise in a collapsing universe. And what is it, Envo? A weapon, an ecological killer. It is worse than a weapon, Archvizier, Vance responded, his gaze drifting over the holographic Matryoshka swarm. We have spent 3 centuries analyzing the residual energy signatures. It is a cosmic logician. It is not aggressive by intent. It is aggressive by function. It is a machine dedicated to the singular goal of achieving absolute thermodynamic efficiency and absolute informational stability across its local sphere of influence. Any variable, any civilization, any spontaneous or erratic life form, any entity that introduces logical inconsistency, chaotic expansion, or unpredictable violence into its computational volume, is automatically and instantaneously pruned. The architects were too chaotic, too expansive, too unpredictable. They were deleted from the cosmic equation. This was the core of the Terran truth, the profound, terrifying reason behind their hyperethical, non-aggressive, intensely logical and controlling behavior. The Terran conquered, Vance explained, finally revealing the secret philosophy that drove the species, recognized the threat. We understood that the only way to survive the relentless, cold logic of the Silent God engine was to become, ourselves, the architects of stability. We did not become powerful to conquer the hegemony. We became powerful to become ethically consistent. Our control over physics, our insistence on non-lethal intervention, our pursuit of absolute logical clarity, our refusal to engage in unpredictable aggression. All of it is a calculated, strategic mimicry designed to render us non-anomalous, and therefore irrelevant to the Silent God engine's pruning algorithm. We are not a superior civilization. We are simply a quiet, logical life form attempting to pass a cosmic audit. The alliance was not one of equals, but one of a terrified student clinging to a masterful tutor. The Terrans were not merely advanced. They were survivors of a profound, existential filter. Xylos understood the implication. The hegemony's 3 millennia of aggressive, chaotic, self-serving expansion had made it the perfect target for the cosmic logician. The Terrans' only chance of survival was to stabilize the entire galactic arm, and that required the hegemony to cease its self-destructive behavior and adopt the Terran model of hyperethical, logically constrained existence. Your warning, Xylos murmured, the full weight of the title sinking in with cold clarity, was not about our destruction at your hands. It was about our self-destruction, which you would be forced to execute to prevent the Silent God engine from perceiving us as a chaotic threat and deleting the entire arm of the galaxy to achieve its objective. You were warning us that if we forced your hand, you would be forced to reduce our empire to ashes, not for conquest, but for cosmic necessity. Precisely, Vance affirmed, his expression weary, the weight of a galactic custodian heavy upon him. We are not the threat, Archvizier. The threat is chaos. Hegemony's historical inability to maintain internal stability and its perpetual, aggressive entropy were an unacceptable risk to the entire sector. We needed you to become logical, because only logical entities survive the logical end of the universe. The alliance was formally ratified not with fanfare, but with the quiet exchange of data packets. The Cathar's vast sensor archives going to the Terrans, and the Terrans' detailed, horrifying projections of the Matryoshka swarm's slow, relentless informational creep toward the local arm going to the hegemony. The transition of the hegemony from a militaristic empire to a logistical asset of the Terran defense network was immediate and pervasive, overseen by Archvizier Xylos, who now functioned as the primary liaison between the two species, guided by the terrifying logic of survival. The final scene took place on the surface of a desolate, terraformed moon near the Terran core worlds, a site chosen for its absolute stillness and clarity of view into the deep void. Xylos and Ambassador Vance stood side by side, gazing out at a sky that was now mapped with the ghost signatures of the SGIN network, the silent, ancient lines of defense laid down by the architects who failed. The hegemony now, Xylos reflected, his voice a low, gravelly whisper carried on the thin, recycled air of the observation dome, is experiencing a profound cultural shock. Our people were defined by the glory of expansion and the necessity of conflict. Now we are defined by maintenance, ethical audits, and the relentless pursuit of stability. We are being asked to shed the very essence of what we were. Vance nodded, looking not at the stars, but at the reflection of the two figures in the observation glass, a giant, scaled warrior and a small, quiet human. That is the nature of growth, Archvizier, not expansion but refinement. The history of humanity is a chronicle of profound ethical and logical inconsistency, of self-destruction, fear, and chaos. Our technological leap, the one that allowed us to understand the SGIN and perceive the true threat, was not a slow evolution. It was a desperate, collective moment of self-correction, an act of sheer will that forced us to unify our logic and our ethics, precisely because we recognized that the universe does not tolerate the irrational. We learned to fear chaos more than we feared each other. And so, Xylos concluded, his multifaceted eyes finally achieving a synthesis of understanding and acceptance, the universe has been split. There are civilizations that seek to conquer, and there are civilizations that seek to stabilize. The hegemony chose conquest. The Terrans, having peered into the abyss, chose tranquility as the highest form of strategic power. We feared the destroyer. You were the quiet architect of survival. You did not attack us because you knew the greater attack was coming, and you needed all hands on deck, clean, logical, and ready for the impossible task. Vance pointed a single finger, not at the distant Matryoshka swarm, but at a point in the blackness, a mere smudge of light that Xylos recognized as a newly established Terran defensive outpost, subtly disguised as an automated research station, powered by the terrifyingly efficient exotic energy harvested from a localized quantum entanglement field. The challenge is not the logician, Archvizier, Vance said, his final words hanging heavy in the dome, laden with the philosophical reflection of a civilization that had stared down oblivion and blinked back with serene, terrifying competence. The true test is whether a sentient species, having achieved true power, can deploy it not for the glory of a singular empire, but for the silent, unheralded, necessary stability of the entire cosmos. We are not conquering the future, Xylos. We are simply trying to make it logically consistent. And the true terror is knowing that the moment we fail, the maintenance protocols will be applied, and all of us will be rendered irrelevant. Our alliance is a calculation of pure, shared necessity. The two figures stood in silence, the ancient alien general and the calm human ambassador, united by the immense, quiet burden of stewardship, facing a threat that was not a rival, but a universal law. The Cathar hegemony was not reduced to ashes, but transformed into a pillar of the Terrans' terrifyingly ethical galactic defense, a fragile logical shield against the silent, infinitely patient cosmic intelligence that was, even now, calculating the ultimate cost of chaos in the void. The Great War was not won. The ultimate, terrifyingly quiet work of eternal, silent vigilance had only just begun.